In this episode of Ideas, I talk with Ron Carucci about his business journey, leadership, and his book, Rising to Power. This was a really interesting conversation. I think you'll gain a lot from it. All right, here we go. All right, today's guest is Ron Carucci. He is managing partner at Navalent and is a seasoned consultant with more than 25 years of experience working with CEOs and senior executives. And today he's here to talk about his book, Rising to Power, The Journey of Exceptional Executives. Ron, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Adam, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. And I'm always interested to hear people's stories, how you became a seasoned consultant with more than 25 years. You've been doing it for 25 years. One, how did you start doing it? Why did you start doing it? If you would, kind of share your journey for me, kind of know where you're coming from, and then also listeners, I'm sure it would be valuable for them as well.
Yeah, so gosh, it feels, it's hard to believe, given how amazingly young that I look, that it's been that long.
That's right.
People often ask me if I started doing this when I was 10. So, I began my career in a very different field, in the arts.
Okay. Cool.
And I was working overseas in Europe with the military and State Department. And we had a contract to use a variety of media and arts to do teaching. And in one particular workshop we were doing, we didn't, back in the 80s, there wasn't the term diversity and inclusion, but if there had been, that's what this workshop would have been called. We were at, of all places, Dachau, and of all places, the chapel at Dachau. And we had East Germans and West Germans and civilians and military and State Department and Americans and military families in this room to talk about valuing differences and about valuing how people live and work together. The Iron Curtain had not yet fallen, so there was still a lot of we-they sentiment. And in the middle of our workshop, a young military soldier, he probably wasn't much older than me at the time, stood up and in a very raw and emotional place, as part of the processing of some of the material we presented, said, "I'm just so tired of being trained to hate." And I was so deeply moved by what he said. First, my first reaction was, I can't believe something we presented up here made him think that.
Yeah. Wow.
And then secondly, I can't believe he had the courage to get up and say it. And third, I wanted to know more. And so we processed the conversation with the group. And then afterwards, we went, it's Munich, so you go out for a beer. That's what you do. We went out and we sat for hours and I listened to his experiences and stories and his heartache. And I think, I don't know how conscious I was at the time, but for me, Adam, that moment was a realization that telling great stories is interesting to me, but entering other people's stories and helping them write their story differently, that's fascinating to me. That's energizing. That gives me life. And I think that moment and that season of my life teaching began to shift my career more toward what does it mean to help other people, other organizations, other communities write their story and their next chapters differently than they might have otherwise. And then when I got my training in org psychology and on into change work, spent a bunch of my career inside companies, learned not quickly enough that, if I was going to probably maintain expressing my passion for organizations, it was probably going to be by not having to be part of one, because I learned painfully that telling the truth and being honest and sometimes being a little bit politically naive inside companies, things don't go as well as they do when you're outside the company, when it's expected of you to do those things. And so I started my consulting career in the mid 90s, and then we started Navalent in 2004, 13 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. And that story you just said about the guy, why do you teach us hate? What a moment in life for you to remember. I mean, that's something you would never forget. I mean, just the whole teaching to consultancy, your whole life has been about helping other people. And it really shows. I mean, after reading your book, the different experiences all add up to your personal perspective, which of course is unique, as is everyone's perspective. That's what makes one's work different and helps the world. Our stories can all add up to something beautiful. It's about putting it out into the world, which you've done. And I really appreciate your book, which we'll start talking about here pretty soon, Rising to Power, The Journey of Exceptional Executives. And it's about, what you just said, working with businesses, being in multiple businesses, helping them become better. This is going to be a deep question, and maybe, this is just a great conversation with you, Ron. But if somebody's looking to do something more with their lives, was there a point in your life where you were more internally focused and wondering, what am I going to do with my life? Or were you more active in just doing what interests you, and it happened to be that it was helping people? Was there a defining moment there, or were you more, did you have a plan, or did you just start doing stuff that interests you and it happened to be to help other people? What
You know,
what did that look like?
That's a great question, Adam. I wish, for as much as I invite other people to be intentional about those kinds of moments, because I think those moments, sometimes they just happen. Sometimes you have to make them happen.
Yeah.
I think mine was just sort of a clumsy collision of experiences bumping into each other, of discovering what I
Hmm.
loved and where I wanted to have impact in the world and where I wanted to, create good change.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I've had a mentor and dear friend. She's been my mentor and friend for like 30 something years.
Wow.
Now, early
That's
on,
cool.
yeah, she's amazing. In my upcoming TED Talk, I actually tell my story about our relationship, and it was really a special thing to be able to do that.
Hmm.
So early on, she sent me to this, back in the 90s, there was this interesting phase of, early in the movement of understanding your purpose and understanding people doing more reflective work, you writing your personal mission statement.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, at the time I was a little bit too cocky in my late 20s, early 30s, whatever I was. And I was like, really, I'm going to go to this? And so fine, I will. And I went. And they have you, working you through all these exercises where you craft this mission statement for yourself. And what was so fascinating was, I'm there to sort of humor her and I'll go along for the ride. But then when I wrote down what I wrote down, it was like this moment of clarity, and like a plumb line had just appeared. And what I wrote down was, I want to be a great agent of change and make other great agents of change.
Mm, that's
And
that's really good. Yeah.
when I think about how I measure my life, or how I make choices between how I spend my time, or what projects to take on, or what consultants I hire, or teach all my courses in grad school where I teach,
Mm-hmm.
it's so interesting to me that that plumb line has always been the arbiter of, is this choice going to help me be a better agent of change and make other great agents of change? And so, for as corny as I thought the workshop was, it really did produce this sense of a plumb line, a sort of a thread that I could use to gauge how I wanted to spend my life. I think I was very fortunate and very blessed in that moment to have that happen. I don't know that I could attribute that coming out of my pen to any really deep, reflective, thoughtful capability by any means.
Well, what I find interesting there is that you had this mantra, if you will, that was easy for you to remember. A lot of mission statements are these broad things, and it was become an agent of change and create other agents of change. And you can remember that with every decision. You can have that there in front of you. But what I also heard there was that you had the same mentor for 30 years. Every mentor I've had that I think of it, maybe 2 or 3 years, and, life changes and they go on to do other things. And I gain another mentor. um, what value have you seen in having the same mentor for 30 years? Because
Oh,
you might be the first person I've ever heard to have one that long. And that's really interesting.
I pinch myself on a regular basis, wondering what did I do to deserve this woman in my life. And she's one of my dearest friends. And she's 77 years old.
Oh, wow.
She,
That's,
you'd
that's
never know
great.
she's a fireball. taught she's taught grad school and at the graduate and PhD levels for 40 years. Amazingly published, brilliant woman, brilliant consultant.
Hmm.
What's so interesting is my son is now in college in New York City, and now
Mm.
she's mentoring him.
Oh, wow. How
So,
cool is that? Oh, my
so
goodness.
my son, I mean, and he's, she was there when my son was born. Before I
Mm,
did, he's my oldest. So she
hmm.
watched me become a father.
Mm.
And she, has always loved him to pieces and sent him birthday presents and been a part of his life. But now he's getting to sit on the other side of what I have talked about for so long, and the impact and the mark she's left on my life.
That's a
And so
story. How
um,
cool. That's
and so
awesome.
yeah. So at my TEDx talk, it was on rising to power. The 4 dimensions of rising to power.
Hmm.
But what I do in the TED talk is I twist the ending and say, I learned these, I recognized these long before I had names for them, because somebody else showed them to me. How she helped me avoid being one of the 50 percenters that failed by helping me understand my own impact in the world and teaching me things that otherwise I could have been one of those 50% failed. And I think we ought to have one of those, and we ought to be one of those, right? There's always somebody coming on the journey behind us that we ought to turn around and reach back to.
That's a really important point. Yeah, because in the struggle to become better, a lot of times the focus can be on ourselves solely, at least at some points in our lives. And that's a really important point to reach back to others and make sure we're intentional about that.
Too often, people get scared, they get isolated,
Yeah.
they become very self-involved. And I think it's important to remember that when we're reaching back, the goal isn't to clone ourselves, right? Mentoring shouldn't mean cloning, which for too many, especially millennials, right? They're so afraid of mentoring and coaching because they feel like your agenda is to make me like you, be a better version of me. And I think we have to be generous in our contribution to others, but not have an agenda that says, you'll be a whole lot better version of you if you're more like me.
That's a really important point as well. I feel like we could talk about this for hours, but I guess we should move on to your book at some point here. But
Yeah.
Rising to Power, I read it. I enjoyed it thoroughly. But before we jump into the heart of the book, we've talked about why consulting, what your journey looked like, but I think it's important to ask you why this book, that you would devote that much time to and needed to get out into the world and make sure that people hear this message. Why did you feel the need for that?
Well, so this was my eighth, and this one started out pretty personally.
Okay.
So, I got a phone call from a young gentleman at one of my client organizations that had been part of our transformational, our initiative there, major overhaul of the organization. And he had been labeled every possible high potential category you could think of. And he was sharp, he was bright, he had certainly distinguished himself, sacrificially contributed to the effort. And at the end of the effort, when he was offered the chance to take on a much broader assignment in the organization, of course, nobody was shocked. Everybody assumed that makes perfect sense. Of course, he'll do great. He assumed he would just continue his meteoric rise in the organization and be the one everybody wanted to follow. And about 10 months later, we had left our part of the work and moved on. And I saw his name in my caller ID, and I was like really excited. I thought, oh, he's calling to check in. I'm going to hear about all these great things that have happened since we left and all the great work he's done. But he was calling to tell me he'd been fired, and could I help him network to other opportunities? And it was like somebody punched me in the stomach. Didn't even have time to catch my breath when 2 hours later, the CEO of the company called as well, really disturbed.
Yeah.
He declined, and to let me know they had to let him go. And more than subtly inferring that some of the responsibility for his failure was mine for not having done a better job preparing him for that role. And of course, that was utterly devastating.
Yeah, I bet.
To have a client that I really admired and respected and had worked a long time with lay the responsibility of another young, promising leader, their failure at my feet. I didn't know what to say. I said, can we come back in? Can I come back and hunt around? How could we have been so wrong? How could we have misjudged? What could have possibly gone sideways here? Can I come in and poke around to find out? Because if I did something wrong here, if I screwed this up somehow or gave him bad advice, I want to know. Other end of this phone call again. And that short investigation is what led eventually to our 10-year longitudinal study that shaped Rising to Power. And, it turns out that young man was just one more statistic. We've known for decades that more than 50% of those that take on broader responsibilities in their organizations fail within the first 18 months. And it's the normal, right? Of course, the recruiters love it because it's an annuity for them. But for everybody else, it's carnage. It's a devastating moment. It's waste. Otherwise, promising, brilliant people rising up suddenly get the opportunity to have roles of great influence and become disasters. It doesn't happen that fast. And so for us, this was we can do better. We have to do better. We cannot continue to waste precious, rare leadership talent by setting them up to fail in situations like these. And so I was on a hunt. I was determined to uncover every landmine, every rock that organizations sometimes unknowingly put in the way of these rising leaders, and to find out what it takes for someone to raise their altitude and stick the landing. And so that's what Rising to Power was.
And, talking about the book, when you look at the book, the title, of course, is on the front, Rising to Power. And that really sticks out because the word power itself can sometimes have a negative connotation. Authors like Robert Greene have written books like 48 Laws of Power. But when you hear the word power, it can sometimes be associated with toxic, that power goes to one's head, they become a bad leader. So I want to ask you about choosing that title, Rising to Power. And then two, how do you view power? Do you view it in a positive light, negative light? Why did you ultimately choose to name the book that?
Yeah, great question, Adam. So, one of the things we expected to find, and of course, now in this season, we look around and expect to find it everywhere, was abuses of power. We
Mm-hmm.
expected to find people using power for, it was one of the dimensions we isolated in the data to see how are these leaders metabolizing power that comes with these roles, and what sources of power are they using. And while we did certainly stumble on the overindulgent, self-interested, sometimes immoral leader who would use power for their own gain, what shocked us, probably the most significant finding in the data, was that the greatest abuse of power wasn't for self-interest or immoral gain or self-service. The greatest abuse of power was the abandonment of it.
Mm.
And
That
if
was really interesting too. Yeah, I noticed that from your findings in your book.
In fact, your listeners might find my other TED talk, which is published now, is on this topic. It unpacks it's how to be more powerful than powerless and how to use the sources of power. But the reality is that most leaders are too afraid to use the
Mm.
power into their role. They become cowards. And what most organizations don't appreciate is that that's every bit as great an abuse of power as using it for self-interest or immoral gain.
Mm.
We write those things off as, oh, he's just indecisive,
Yeah,
or she's just a little unassertive. She's learning. She's growing her backbone, and we dismiss these abuses as though they're just idiosyncratic quirks that we can work on. But we need to see these as equally as abusive, equally as destructive to organizations and communities, and help leaders understand that power is a responsibility. It comes with a role. And you have multiple sources of power in your relationships and the information you have and in the position you hold. And your job is to adjudicate that power, to actively seek ways to use that power for the greater good of the community you're leading. That's your
mm.
job.
That's
Uh,
good.
how you feel about it, how uncomfortable you are, what you can get out of it, those are irrelevant criteria. And if you don't understand that about a broader leadership role that you're taking on, you shouldn't take it. If you're going to collapse to the issue of, I don't want to disappoint people, I want them to like me, I don't want to use my power in a way that alienates anybody and makes them feel bad, I don't want to have to make hard priority calls that make people feel like winners and losers, and all of that need to be popular, need to be liked, need to be revered, need that comes, it's a natural byproduct of feeling so isolated. When you rise up, you are isolated. That is part of the cruelty of the call of being in a leadership role. You are separate, you are different. And you can neutralize hierarchy so that it's not a status issue, but you can't neutralize the imbalance of power. What
Mm.
you can do is use the power effectively so that others can benefit from it. And sometimes that means saying no. Sometimes that means disappointing people. Leadership is the ability to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb. That's what you're supposed to do, to narrow the priorities of an organization, to focus people on where they can be successful, even that means foregoing great ideas. And if you're uncomfortable with that, if the ripple effect, if the blowback, if the disruption that causes, you just can't withstand that, then accept that and don't take a job.
That's really good. I love that perspective. And in the book, you say that Robert Greenleaf, he was an executive at AT&T. He said that the only legitimate application of power within organizations is in the service of others. And I really love that quote and that you mentioned that there. But going back to what you just said, you quickly said how you define leadership. Did you come up with that definition yourself?
It actually comes from out of Ron Heifetz's work at Harvard.
Okay.
Uh, and he wrote Leadership on the Line and No Easy Answers, great
Yeah.
thinker on leadership. And I'm badly paraphrasing his definition, but in essence, it's that leadership is the ability to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb.
Mm, that is so good. Is that how you would define leadership too? Did you
I,
think
I,
about
I,
that?
certainly, I certainly think it's one of them.
Yeah.
The more fundamental definition of leadership is having followers.
Yeah. That's easy to remember. Yeah.
One's following you, you're not leading.
Yeah. Yeah.
It certainly isn't about a title. It certainly isn't about a position. There's lots of people out there who've done a good job debunking leadership. I think one of the things that's in the 80s, the emerging research talked about the ability to influence others to do things you believe should be done. But now, of course, all we hear in that is the manipulative aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is, there is a part of leadership that is manipulation, right? You
Mm.
are
Yeah,
shaping
true.
others' views, you are shaping others' behavior. The question is, are you doing it in a manipulative way? Are you doing it in a way that's dishonest, inauthentic, and disingenuous? And that's when it becomes a problem, right? When you're trying to bribe people to do it, or buy their loyalty with favors, or curry favor with them through admiration, or inadvertently, in a very codependent way, purchase their admiration of you. Those are all the subtle toxins of leadership that make you, on the surface, appear to be a wonderful human being and somebody that people want to be around, but underneath, you're forming very unhealthy attachment to others. You're forming very unhealthy relationships to the people, to your stakeholders, and inside you're probably extremely stressed because you're having to re-up the game every day rather than building healthy, honest relationships with those you lead. At the end of the day, leadership is a relationship. It isn't something you do to people or for people. It's something you do with them.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're someone who needs to preside over, or you're someone who needs to do to, and you're a utilitarian in how you exercise leadership, your influence will be short lived.
That's a good point. You said it's definitely not a title. Speaking of leadership, do you think that's the biggest leadership myth out there, or is there something else?
I think there's a lot of mythology out there about leadership, Adam. I think the one that I see leaders stumbling in, and I'm not sure anybody ever says it out loud to them, but there's this presumption of ease. There's this presumption of competence, right? So
Mm.
if I've risen up in a hierarchy, if I've been promoted, if I've been elevated, if I've earned my right to take on a broader assignment in my company or another company, and have other people reporting to me, I must be worthy of that. I must be able
Mm.
to do it. You certainly see the classic failures of taking the most technically astute person in an engineering or medical field or in some discipline and assuming that because their technical competence is so strong, they'll be able to lead and putting them above people and watching that be a disaster, right? So I think the presumption of preparation, and in our research, we found that 60 something percent of the people in our study said they were not prepared for the roles they took on. 70% of them said that their organizations didn't do anything to help prepare them
Mm.
once they got the job.
Wow. Wow. That's
So,
huge.
organizations are doing a lot to, cause these otherwise very promising leaders to stumble because they just assume they're ready for the role and they're not.
There was a problem that you mentioned in the book, and I wanted to get kind of from you what exactly that is. You say that the playing down problem you've seen time and time again in organizations that you've consulted with. I just want to know, what is that problem, and how can that be fixed? Because I think it's interesting that you've seen it time and time again. So there's probably a listener that might be dealing with it. So what is that and how can it be fixed?
Well, it's a great question. So part of the challenge of rising up to higher levels in organizations is that your time horizons change. Your altitude is thinner. The air is thinner at the altitude,
Mm-hmm.
and there's less tangibility in your impact. Your results should take longer to get.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of uncertainty and risk. And for many leaders, the expertise that they had long been gratified for comes from the role they left, right? And
Yeah.
so sometimes letting go of that work, letting go of the gratification. And so you hear the justification all the time. You hear them say, well, I'm going to work on a gradual transition of handing that stuff off to them, but they're not ready yet. You just code for I'm not ready to let go. And so when leaders take the work with them as they rise up from where they came from, they create compression, right? They're playing below the level of the role, and they create this disempowered compression in the organization where everybody then has to, play below the altitude of their role. And so things bottleneck, people feel disempowered or micromanaged, people feel like they have no maneuvering room, their sense of autonomy is impaired. It has significant consequences for the leader who simply just can't let go and learn to tolerate the uncertainty, the ambiguity, the longer time horizons, the stewarding of the future that's required of a broader role of influence. And that's that lack of preparation, right? I get to that role, I kind of feel like it's like getting to the top of this mountain where you're skiing and there's a lot of fog and you can't see where to go. So you look down and you look back because that's where your sense of certainty used to be. It's not true, but we self-soothe
Right.
when and sometimes self-soothing is doing what I used to do, that I was so good at that everybody told me I was great at.
Mm-hmm. And in the book, you definitely point out what makes a bad leader. You say that bad leaders are unclear, unskilled, or unwilling. So I guess my question to you, would a great leader be the opposite of those things? What in your mind would make a great leader?
Well, clear, skilled, and willing would be a good start.
Yeah. Clear, skilled, and willing. That's right.
I'll take that level of clarity.
Absolutely.
I mean, one of the things that was really wonderful about the research for me was being able to isolate I'm not sure we intentionally went looking for this, but there were four recurring patterns. So if 50% were failing, what were the other 50% doing that helped them stick the landing? And the great news was there were four very consistent patterns that repeated themselves. I had the research team got a little sick of me. I had them do like almost 100, literally 99 regression analyses on the data to keep cutting it up. And no matter how we cut it, these same four patterns kept recurring. The thing that was troubling to me was that the successful set of leaders in the sample did all four of them well. And I was trying to get to a place where I could say 3 out of 4 is okay, or you could do 2 great and learn 2. And that's what got you in the failure group, right? 3 out of 4 got you in the tanking group. And they finally said, enough, Ron, stop. There's no more ways to cut this. It is what it is. You have to say what it says, which is it's 4 or nothing. But the reality is it explains, at least in part, why the failure is so high, because the stakes are so high and the bar is so high. Mm-hmm. Those 4 patterns were breadth. So leaders who knew how to stitch the seams of an organization and create cohesion, who knew how all the pieces of an organization fit together. They could see the whole, not just the functional area they came from. Context. They were curious. They could learn. They could read the tea leaves. They could not just impose their answer on the environment, but ask questions and adapt. Choice. They could make those hard calls. They could say no. They could narrow the focus of an organization. They didn't need to please people and buy people with yeses. They could make hard choices. And then connection. They had amazing relationships. They could build trust and credibility with direct reports, with peers, with bosses. And interestingly, their connection and their stakeholder priorities were based on who they could help succeed, not who they could get something from. They were focused on finding others they could help make better and invested their relationships that way. So you can see 4 very challenging and beefy dimensions of leadership, and being all good at any one of them is hard enough, but being all good at all 4 of them is a high bar. But that's what it takes.
No, that's really good. Yeah. Ron, you offered us so much today. I didn't get to all the questions that I wanted to ask, but that definitely gives people a good idea of just how good Rising to Power is. If there's one thing either we could have talked about it already today, or if it's something that didn't come up in our conversation, I just want to ask, what's one last piece of advice you'd like to leave listeners with today?
Well, so I'll go back to my mentor. It's one of the things she taught me early on, which was nothing in life is irrevocable except death. You get do-overs, right? You get second chance. And, being fearful and anxious about trying things, or, holding back or overly worrying about other people think, you're going to skin your knees. If you're going to try things that are important, you're going to probably stumble, but you got to get out there, right? So I think had I applied that insight earlier in my life than I did, I think I would have spent far less time anxious and worried and fearful or second guessing than I did.
That's beautiful, powerful advice for people contemplating whether they should take a step or not. It's really best to take the step. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of listeners out there who could benefit from that advice. The book is Rising to Power. Ron, last question for you. Where would you like to send people to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, I'd love to keep the conversation going, Adam. So first of all, if you come to our website, navalent.com, we've got a bunch of stuff there. First of all, we've got a great virtual summit on leading change. It's called Leading Through Turbulence, coming up with some phenomenal speakers. Dan Pick, John Haidt, Dory Clark, Nilofer Merchant, and just a wonderful lineup. So you can come on our website at navalent.com, and there's a button right at the top where you can click to register. That's March 5th through 9th. And it's free for that week. And we also have an option to buy us for access for a whole year to an ongoing learning community of change. We have a free ebook for you on leading transformation organizations. So if you come to navalent.com/transformation and download that ebook, and so to get our playbook for how we lead change. We've got a quarterly magazine called the Navalent Quarterly on all kinds of topics of leadership and organization and teams. You can get that at the website. You can find me on Twitter at Ron Carucci. You can find me on LinkedIn. So I'd love to keep the conversation going. Stay in touch.
Awesome. And I think people will really benefit from all of that. So Ron, thank you again for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
Adam, the pleasure is mine. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you got something out of these ideas. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.